a dark day in the history of the American Republic. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and I must talk about the most extraordinary riotous protest, the storming of the American Capitol by Trump protesters. This has profound implications for the Trump movement, the tens of millions of people who've supported Donald Trump, has implications for Trump himself, and also the American Republic as a whole. This has no historical comparator from what I can see. We all saw before our very eyes someone with horns and a kind of a Viking jacket as the presiding chair. Now, he may do a better job than the person who ends prayers with amen and a woman. Nevertheless, he wasn't duly elected. And this has had genuine human cost. For all the jokes, one woman has been shot and killed by police, an Air Force veteran, a remarkable individual by all accounts. And up to 4 people in total have died so far, although she's the only one for whom I presently have the details. Then there's the fact that any attempt to rehabilitate the Trump legacy is now completely shot. See, what happens with US presidents is people don't like them at the time. Then they look with a bit more sobriety on their real achievements, and they may or may not be rehabilitated. So sometimes that's even undeserved. I mean, George W. Bush is vastly more popular today than he was in the final years of his presidency. And one can really question whether or not that popularity is justified given the Iraq War, the absolute disasters of the global financial crisis, and so on. And yet, he's now a very popular figure in the United States. Same is potentially true for Richard Nixon, where in his case, he had genuine foreign policy achievements. He did bamboozle the Soviet Union. He opened things up with China. He did shift the global balance of power towards the United States, but he was also a criminal and had the Watergate scandal. In the Trump's case, there was plenty of opportunity for a few years from now when people went in your face, where he wasn't top of the news cycle, where people didn't have Trump derangement syndrome anymore, to be able to talk to his real achievements, of which there are many. Peace in the Middle East, the fact that Kim Jong-un hasn't tested a thermonuclear device or an ICBM in 3 years. We have the first middle-class pay rise in the United States in 35 years. No new wars in the Middle East. NATO paying its fair share. Extraordinary stuff. Things that had been long-running American objectives that Donald Trump has managed to deliver. Things that had vexed many of his predecessors. So there are things that you can tip your hat off to Trump and are deserved real achievements. But now every time you say, well, yeah, okay, what about the fact that Israel now has normalized relations with a bunch of new countries? And they say, well, yeah, okay, but Trump refused to concede the election and his supporters stormed the Capitol. Right? Okay. Well, what about the fact that there's no new wars in the Middle East? Yeah, well, that's true, but Trump refused to concede and his supporters stormed the Capitol. This is the response that will be given to any attempt to look at the Trump legacy, but also reflecting on his supporters. Because what's happened with this particular case is people who dislike the Trump movement, who are anti-Trump, who think that all Trump voters are xenophobic, racist, white supremacists, and so on, even though that absolutely does not reflect the movement as a whole, well, their biases are confirmed in a profound way when you have people storming the Capitol in a totally anti-democratic way. Now, the one thing that I can say for Trump in this case is that he genuinely believes what he is saying. He's not sitting there cynically thinking that he lost the election. He genuinely believes that there was a conspiracy to steal it from him. Now, and it's not hard to be generous. It's not hard to see why he might think that. I mean, he had the entire national security apparatus against him. They were fearful that he would improve relations with Russia. This is from the very beginning when he came in. Now, as it turns out, the Trump administration had one of the worst relationships with Russia. Trump sold weapons, offensive weapons, to the Ukrainians, something that Obama steadfastly refused to do his entire term in office. Trump expelled some 70-odd diplomats after the Novichok assassination that occurred in Britain. And Trump also has been putting enormous pressure on Germany and other places to, first of all, increase its defense expenditure in line with NATO objectives, so strengthening European NATO as a whole, but also to try and prevent the spread of economic dependency on Russia against the new Nord Stream pipeline. So Trump has been very strong on those issues, but nevertheless, because he was an outsider, because he represented a group of people that weren't part of the Beltway, the national security establishment really did conspire to thwart his objectives. And he was thwarted every time, even by his own cabinet. I mean, remember Rex Tillerson? It was revealed that Secretary of Defense Mattis had, on numerous occasions, failed to carry out Trump's orders as commander-in-chief. And then we see the impeachment, 3-year Mueller investigation that absolutely went nowhere, total hoax of an investigation. Trump was right about that. And then when he was impeached, it was over a phone call where nothing was wrong, and it wasn't even with the Russians, it was with the Ukrainians. Totally political witch hunt, absolutely anti the Constitution, anti-convention, totally a spit in the face of the tens of millions of Trump supporters. And then what you had on election day was an individual who, despite basically running dead, got more votes than President Obama and lost a absolute record number of counties. So basically all these mail-in ballots arriving after the election polls had closed, with totally blank sheets, except for the fact that they had voted for Biden. So it didn't vote anywhere down the line in terms of Republican or Democrat. And thus, Trump had this narrative in his head built up not just over the course of this election, but over many years, that they would conspire to steal it from him. Now, do I agree with any of that? No, I don't. I think that Biden did encourage his supporters to do mail-in voting. They encouraged them to do that because people were afraid of coronavirus. And Trump, foolishly, I think, really encouraged, really called into question early the legitimacy of the ballots. So I think a lot of Republican voters were deterred from voting. A lot of people that would have voted by mail-in ballot themselves, because they themselves have either been affected by or are concerned about the virus, they didn't turn up. And then ultimately, Trump's performance at the first presidential debate was far too belligerent. I think many people who ended up voting for Biden via mail-in voting voted early by sending in those mail-in ballots at the time. So for those reasons, I don't think that there's a truly illegal attempt to steal the election. There were changes to state rules. It is deeply questionable whether or not ballots should be accepted after polls close, because it means that let's say you wait until the end of the polling close, the count starts, you see that your candidate is behind and it's very close. Oh my goodness, I better get in my mail-in ballot so as that my preferred candidate gets in. That is something that could absolutely happen, and it was totally unfair. You get to see the results being tallied before you decide whether or not to cast your vote and who for. So these are genuine concerns. But nevertheless, when the Supreme Court of the United States refused to hear Trump's complaints because they deemed him to be vexatious or frivolous or unlikely to succeed, that was the last and final moment that Trump had to bow out with grace and honor, to say, look, we've tried to lodge our legal returns. These have not been successful. We've exhausted our legal opportunities as proceedings to try and get this looked at. And thus, I have no choice but to congratulate President Joe Biden. And now this is something that Trump absolutely must have done. And it reminds me of what Al Gore did in 2000. Al Gore came up and said, look, he strongly disagrees with the United States Supreme Court decision, but he accepted it and wished President George Bush all the best of luck. So these are things that will go down in infamy, that Trump refusing to concede election despite having exhausted all the possibilities of having this looked at, despite having a Republican-dominated Supreme Court of the United States with 3 of the justices on there having been nominated by himself. It was looking grim. It was looking grim. And even if you believe that the election was in some way impacted, and I don't, but if you believe that, then you have to acknowledge that there is a system of checks and balances stronger in the United States than anywhere else in the world to make sure that these things are free and fair. And the fact that those umpires had judged against him is the result. You just have to accept that result. Now, the fact that Trump still really hasn't in many ways will be what undoes not just him, but his legacy for decades to come. Because I firmly believed until today that once Trump was off the 24-hour news cycle, when other issues were on board, when the corruption and rot of the Democratic Party was the only thing in town and people were starting to look at it, and the media outlets themselves with their flagging readership and flagging viewership actually had to start doing real journalism, that we would see a revisiting of the Trump legacy. People would look back on those Trump years, the pre-COVID Trump years, as a kind of a golden era where a lot of positive things happened for ordinary working Americans. That was the time when the Republican Party connected with ordinary people for the first time, working class people in the so-called flyover states of Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, and all these other places with new groups. He overperformed in the election with Hispanic Americans, for example, and massively increased his vote among male Black Americans. So Trump did a lot of great things during his time in office and a lot of good things for the Republican Party until they absolutely committed national suicide through not just this process, but also kind of jettisoning Trump along the way. Nevertheless, this movement isn't going away. This movement is not going away. I think Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, they will inherit the dedicated Trump base. I would suspect there is a good chance that Josh Hawley will be the next Republican nominee for president in 2024 because he stuck with Trump till the end, and his supporters will not forget that, and those supporters will turn out in 2024 to try and get their person up, and therefore likely Josh Hawley. And Josh Hawley is much better spoken than Trump. He's a much more polished politician than Trump. He's young. He has a bright future ahead of him. And despite all the criticism that's being leveled against him right now, of which there is a great deal, a lot of that will be either forgotten or a faded memory in 4 years' time. Politics, 4 years is an eternity in politics, but it won't be when it comes to this particular Trump legacy for Trump himself. And with respect to Trump himself, he's lucky if he gets out of this okay. I mean, Twitter has done something absolutely unprecedented. They have blocked his account for 12 hours. Twitter has blocked the account of the President of the United States. A whole video can be done on this. I gave a video, which I'll leave a link to as well, describing the absolute crisis of democracy that it is when Twitter starts to editorialize or censor public officials, let alone the President of the United States. And that's totally unjustified. They're assuming a degree of power that is making the problem worse. Twitter thinks they're making the problem better because it's being cheered on by their local friends in Silicon Valley, but it's really contributing to the massive tribalism that is of crisis in the United States, absolute crisis point in the United States, because by denying people their First Amendment rights to express themselves freely, and Twitter does claim platform protections in that regard. So they say that they're basically a telephone company, and the telephone company doesn't censor who you calls or what you say on those calls. They're acting as a publisher. but they're claiming those platform protections. And thus, by denying whole swathes of the population, including the president himself, of their First Amendment rights, then the Trump supporters who are very angry on a tinderbox can rightly feel prejudiced against and victimized. And thus, there will be a backlash against that. So Twitter is being incredibly short-sighted, even though it's being cheered on by all the right people. And no doubt, when Inauguration Day comes on the 20th of January, Trump's Twitter account may be completely closed. They'll probably wait until he says something mildly provocative, which will be half a day, and then they will close his account permanently. And then Trump will have to move to Parler or some other platform, and thus the divide will get even stronger because millions of conservatives have moved over to Parler. If Trump moves over to Parler, millions more will follow him, and thus they won't even be talking to one another. They'll just be in two separate ecosystems, Twitter, Parler, yin and yang, black and white. And we will have a new fractious destruction of the American Republic because there is no unifying figure in the United States right now. This is the real trouble for the Republic, is that if there was a Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang ticket in the White House right now, none of this would have happened. Things would have calmed down dramatically. There would have been a call to unity. Everyone would remember what it is to be an American. Everyone would see the other side as human with different ideas to achieve the same outcome, not evil, pernicious individuals whose ideology wants to destroy the United States as it is right now. And then, of course, the total fragmentation and deadlock of the American political system is of enormous both propaganda and real benefit to the People's Republic of China. China is the absolute greatest beneficiary of what's been going on right now because the United States cannot focus on its grand strategic objectives to advance American interests abroad, to build a coalition to deal with the communist rise. China can just sit there and do reruns of today's events on any response to any criticism that China does. They'll be like, well, look at how sick America is and look what's going on there. And the terrible thing is they'd be right to do so. So a very difficult day for the Americans. Truly terrible for Trump supporters because they'll never be able to get the legitimacy that I think they deserve. Absolutely disastrous behavior, catastrophically terrible idea to storm the Capitol. The people involved do need to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And one thing I will say for conservatives is that they've been much faster to condemn the extreme behaviors of their own side than the Democrats have for certain groups, which I won't name, who've committed terrible things on their side. But nevertheless, it is an extraordinarily extreme event to have protesters storm the US Capitol buildings. And the violence is absolutely foreseeable. The police were completely overrun. Senate offices and things have been absolutely trashed. So I just don't see any positive redeeming thing that comes out of this. And I think the Democrats are going to use all of the power that they've now accumulated. So with two Senate seats, both Senate seats in Georgia flipping to Democrats, largely because of the open rift between the Republican Party and Trump meant that just Georgian Republicans refused to go out for these people. Then we're going to see a lot of backlash against Republicans across the board, given that for the next 2 years at least, it's going to be a Democrat White House, Democrat House of Representatives, and a Democratic Senate. Really tragic things all round. So with that, I don't really have much positive to say, except this is a dark day in the history of the United States. It really does make 2020 seem like the good old days, as Claire Lehman pointed out. So yeah, welcome to the new year, everybody. If you found value in this, please do give a like. It's not an enjoyable topic, but helps grow the channel. And do leave a comment down below because I'd be happy to engage with it. Hopefully something will happen to bring America together, but both sides see each other as the worst thing that could happen to the Republic. They don't have much in common and they have no cause for dialogue. So I'm worried that civil strife in the United States is going to continue to get worse, just as it does with other major themes of the social contract. So the social mobility in the United States is now completely ossified. The distance between rich and poor is just absolutely eye-watering, and ordinary Americans are being left behind. And in an era where people have been in lockdowns, their economic prospects have been absolutely eviscerated, and a sense of tribal division, an outgoing president who refuses to concede. It's a tinderbox situation, and people should not underestimate it. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time.